Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. For those of you that are joining online or wherever you might be, my name is Diana Kopansky, and I have the honor to lead the Global Peatlands Initiative on behalf of the United Nations Environment Program. It's my pleasure to welcome you here from around the world to this session on connecting peatland research at our Peatland Pavilion at the UNFCCC COP in Glasgow. The theme for today, you must have already guessed it, is working together. It's so important, and we urgently need to work together to tackle the climate and nature crisis. We can only do it across sectors, across borders, across cultures and languages. And I just want to invite you to join in if you're not already looped into the Global Peatlands Initiative or into a research community. Dive in. I personally thrive in positive collaboration. And I also have the joy to co-lead the Global Peatlands Initiative Research Working Group together with Professor Mark Reed. The working group aims to bring people together, peatlands researchers specifically from around the world, to develop relevant interdisciplinary and impactful research to inform and advance policy and practice. It was formed in 2019. And we've been really working hard to push interdisciplinary research and create opportunities and platforms to identify research priorities and to help people connect. Quite often, people don't know how to do that, and we've been really trying to facilitate that. So this approach really enables us as a research community and us as well from the policymakers' point of view to make sure that your research has direction, it's relevant, timely, and it speaks to the needs of decision makers. Because there's nothing I personally think more rewarding than having your science used for the greater good. For the past 2 years, we've organized a series of online training sessions for peatland researchers, drawing on incredible experts from around the world. You must have seen Lynn Rockefeller earlier today. She was leading a field trip research training, as well as Tatiana Minyava, Pete Louis from South Africa. So we're really connecting you with the global expertise around the world to fill capacity gaps and also to fill the needs that you've expressed. And today we have the pleasure to expand our scope of collaboration and reach out to the Adaptation Research Alliance, ARA, which is a global collaborative effort to increase investment and opportunities for action research to develop effective adaptation solutions. The ARA focuses on, of course, action-oriented research. It also has a focus on adaptation to reduce risk from climate change, particularly for countries and communities that are most vulnerable. And we have Jesse DeMaria Kinney from the ARA Secretariat, and he'll be our first speaker of the day. He will present the principles that underpin the work of the Alliance to ensure that climate adaptation research, policy, and practice have the greatest possible impact. Jesse DeMaria Kinney is the head of the Adaptation Research Alliance Secretariat. He has 15 years of experience with international and local NGOs and the United Nations, working at the interface of science, policy, practice. His work is focused on the thematic areas of climate change adaptation, nature-based solutions, and research for impact, including multi-stakeholder process, design, and facilitation. I'm going to hand over to Jesse to share a little bit more about the principles. Over to you, Jesse.
Great. Thank you very much, Diana. Good afternoon, COP26, and good evening and good morning to others joining from virtually from around the world. As you've heard, my name is Jesse DeMaria Kinney, and it's a pleasure to be here today to present on behalf of the ARA Secretariat and share a little bit about the Alliance itself and also the Adaptation Research Impact Principles. Next slide, please. So, the Adaptation Research Alliance is a global collaborative effort to catalyze increased investment and capacity for action-oriented research. And this is, of course, to support effective adaptation actions, primarily in developing countries. We also believe that we must work at the scale and the urgency that's demanded by science. So therefore, we've brought together a coalition of institutions across the adaptation research and then the action communities that brings together a transdisciplinary group of actors, which is now currently the ARA members, which I'll show briefly in a moment. Our starting point here is that, as you can see, there's a disconnect between academic research and action. And this is particularly a disconnect between research and the needs of the most vulnerable. Some other barriers are misaligned incentives and institutional barriers. There's also low coherence and coordination across adaptation research, with various projects being very short-term, project-based, kind of ad hoc. There's also limited capacity in communities and in developing countries. And due to various reasons of funding and also capacity, there's limited learning from implementation. So this paradigm shift, responding to the scale and the urgency that's needed, we see science must engage with action, and of course, vice versa, the action must also engage with science. So these two must become interweaved, a research action nexus, or part of a continuum of knowledge and evidence generation to action and to implementation. So this requires an agile ecosystem of action research, which brings together various influential actors, from action funders and research funders to policymakers and stakeholders on the front lines of climate change, but also, of course, researchers, practitioners, and intermediaries. The Adaptation Research Alliance has been working toward this goal since early 2020, and we will have the formal launch coming up next week on Tuesday at the Science and Innovation Day, so please do join us there. Next slide, please. Here you can see the ARA mission statement. And so just to unpack this a bit, to say really, in other words, that the ARA aims to achieve a paradigm shift in the way that research is planned, resourced, and carried out. And this shift spans from catalyzing investments to improving the evidence base for adaptation solutions and supporting strengthening capacities for the most vulnerable. And ultimately, also, the ARA aims to make researchers valued partners for policymakers, practitioners, and communities. So we believe that by strengthening the research implementation linkages, we collectively will be able to address the immediate knowledge needs to inform adaptation actions and to support innovative user-driven solutions. So how can we achieve this? Well, as you can see before you, we have 6 principles, and I won't go into our theory of change as to how we can achieve it, or our 6 work streams. You can check out our webpage for further information on that. But I did want to highlight these 6 adaptation research for impact principles that have been co-developed by a core group of 33 institutions, and they're used to guide the activities of the ARA and the members. And what we aim to do here is better align and link knowledge to action. So we really believe that the endorsement of these principles by the members and by the ARA community will contribute to instigating the systemic change in this landscape of action research. And this change is, of course, that one that will put the needs of the most vulnerable at the front. So the principles themselves, the 6 here you can see, they really, and I'll walk through them here in just a moment, but they address the purpose of the research processes themselves, the value and benefits of research, and the linkages between research and action. So next slide, please. You can see here principle 1, which is research is needs-driven, solutions-oriented, and leads to a positive impact on the lives of those at risk from climate change. So in other words, who or what is the research for? Action research for adaptation is driven by the needs, it must be driven by the needs of the users, and seeks to be solutions-oriented. So research processes should aim to find practical and implementable solutions that can make a positive impact on the lives of vulnerable communities. And also the research priorities and agendas should be set through open and inclusive processes that reflect all stakeholder context, needs, and interests. Next slide, please. Thank you. Is the second principle here, as you can see, is research is transdisciplinary and co-produced with users, which again, this is about how should research be carried out. And here we believe that from the outset, research is co-produced with the people who will use it in practice, and the research processes really must embrace the transdisciplinary approaches that emphasize collaboration, as you've already heard at the start from Diana's opening. So research processes should include a wide variety of stakeholders from the research to action spectrum, and they must draw from actors from science, from policy, from practice, as well as I've said before, the most vulnerable groups facing the front line of climate change. These processes must also incorporate thinking across boundaries of knowledge and boundaries of disciplines, and therefore enable really an authentic inclusion of traditional and indigenous knowledge and also embrace the diversity of framings and narratives, voices and sectors, and also different knowledge systems as well. Next slide, please. Principle 3, you can see, is research emphasizes societal impact. And this is really about how research is valued. Research should deliver societal impact at scale by ensuring the uptake of knowledge as well as innovative solutions for enhancing the resilience of the most vulnerable. So the outcomes, research outcomes, should be measurable, and the metrics for measuring those outcomes should actually be developed with those at risk and those who are actually working towards the needs that are most relevant to them. So research institutions and funders should incentivize these outcomes, and they must be directed towards overcoming the challenges that are most relevant to those communities and individuals at risk. Next slide, please. Principle 4, you can see here, is research builds capacity and empowers actors for the long term. So again, this is what can research enable? And here we put forth that research processes should sustainably enhance the capacity of local institutions, of organizations, of coalitions, practitioners, and researchers alike. Now, this requires that information and tools and the knowledge products are widely accessible. So they must be, of course, available in appropriate languages. This is both scientific as well as more lay terminology, but also, of course, actual languages themselves in terms of being English, Spanish, Swahili, Bengali, etc. And of course, they must not be behind a paywall. So these tools and these resources should also be embedded in capacity development activities that can empower actors with the knowledge and actually enable them to drive action themselves. And one aspect to really highlight here that in terms of empowerment, that research should also not perpetuate existing inequalities, but rather empower the actors, to question existing practices and produce alternative, innovative and inclusive pathways for adaptation actions. Next slide, please. Thank you. So now we're looking here at number 5, and this is the research processes address structural inequalities that lead to increased vulnerability and reduced adaptive capacity of those at risk. And again, this is how can research address the root causes of risk. So action research recognizes that power relations manifest through intersectoral, gender-based, economic, social, and political inequalities and inequities. And these inequities are often the root causes of vulnerability. So research should encourage all sections of society, especially the vulnerable and marginalized individuals and groups, to meaningfully participate in and even lead decision-making adaptation for decision-making for adaptation, and for transformative action. Research should also recognize and mitigate the different power dynamics and power relations, which often leave these vulnerable groups or specific gender or sexual minorities, as well as other marginalized groups, out of this meaningful engagement. And therefore, of course, they're unable to actually benefit from these adaptation actions. So in summary, everyone must have an equal right to be heard. And then the 6th principle, next slide, please. Thank you, is really about learning by doing. This is, as you can see, learning by doing enables adaptation action to be evidence-based and increasingly effective. And here, this is really about how can research and action links be strengthened. So we know that research and action processes for adaptation involve inclusive monitoring and evaluation, and sharing processes of monitoring and evaluating allow for learning by doing. And the stronger integration of emerging lessons of what's working and what is not working is sorely needed in this area. In addition, iterative research processes are able to bring in emerging knowledge and allow adaptation efforts to adjust accordingly and improve effectiveness over time. So flexible approaches to the research processes, as well as the action processes from planning to implementation, also allow real-time feedback loops between the research and the action. This is critical, and I will just touch on that briefly in a case study coming up after this. But maybe just to conclude with the principles is saying that despite the best science we have today, there's still plenty of uncertainties around effective adaptation, the best adaptation options, and this type of approach enables effective anticipatory action in complex situations where there's still a high degree of uncertainty. So next slide, please. What I just want to do here is highlight one case study, and this is one of what we consider iconic examples or kind of good practice of this type of action research. And this is from the Mahila Housing Trust. And as you can see here, it's an organization that works in housing development in India. And what I really want to highlight here was just the iterative process that was used in this. As you can see here, there is actually training with a local women's group to measure and track the temperature inside of their homes. So again, there's a capacity building aspect that helped the women actually understand how to use some, let's say, technological equipment to be able to actually track the temperatures themselves. And then using cooling technologies that had been installed, they of course continue to monitor the actual indoor air temperatures. And then we're able to provide feedback to the actual research teams and the people who are implementing these cooling temperatures. So again, through this iterative process of going back and forth between the research that identified the needs, the communities who had these needs also very close to their heart and one of their most critical needs, they were able to actually inform various iterations of what technologies were in fact the best for this housing. So this actually resulted in this local community of actually having women being trained in the use of some of these technologies. It allowed them to have one of their most important needs met. And it also, again, allowed this strengthened kind of feedback loops between the academic community or scientists and also these local women. So then just really the last slide here. The next one, please, is just to show you that the ARA, again, has continued growing membership. We have over 90 organizations. As I said, the official launch is next week. And I just would like to invite you all to come along next Tuesday, but of course, reach out to us if you have any questions. And thank you for this whirlwind tour of the principles, but I wanted to make sure that we have plenty of time to hear from, of course, Professor Mark Reed and also get into some breakout groups. So thank you very much, Diana.
Thank you so much, Jesse, and congratulations. We know the power of partnership and working together, and it certainly takes both an attitude, a passion, and a capability that it doesn't come natural to many, but you seem to have it. So thanks so much for sharing that. We really do appreciate to be connected with you in the Adaptation Research Alliance. And I want to just give a quick shout out to Hans Schutten from Wetlands International. He was the one that connected us. And that's what we're doing here. That's what we're inviting you to do, to connect through the Peatlands Pavilion. The principles you shared, Jesse, are really similar to what we stand by as the Global Peatlands Initiative. And now I'd like to introduce everyone to Professor Mark Reed from Scotland's Royal College. You might already have seen him, and if you haven't, you're in for a treat. Mark co-chairs the Global Peatlands Initiative Research Working Group with myself, and he is a research lead for the IUCN UK Peatland program and runs a training company called Fast Track Impact. He has recently published similar principles to enable research institutions to generate more impact from their research, and he'll be expanding on his forthcoming book, Impact Culture, which will be published in the new year. In case you weren't aware, we're really at the cutting edge here. We like to push boundaries, and so our session will be interactive. We'll be giving you all an opportunity to share in smaller groups. And after Mark shares his presentation, you won't need me to pop back in. He'll tell us more ideas about what we're going to be talking about and how we're going to be breaking the rules of the conference platform and having big breakout groups. So right now I'd like to pass. Here you go, Mark Reed. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much indeed. A pleasure to be here, and I am a little nervous about how the technology works, but for those of you there in person, it should be a little bit simpler for you at least. So my task, as Diana said, is to set the scene for the discussion groups that are going to be coming up and to get you thinking about how you use your research to generate more impact and what you might be able to do to try and transform the broader research and impact culture that you find yourself in. So Jesse, I loved what you said there, loads of points of connection. And I have to say that when I first heard about the Adaptation Research Alliance, I was really excited because unusually, every organization that wants to join has to sign up to the principles we've just heard to encourage us to engage in more transdisciplinary, action-led research that's inclusive, empowering, and impactful. And of course, these are goals that I know many of the peatland research community hold dear. As we all know, peatlands are one of the most significant carbon stores in the world, and damaged peatlands are a major contributor to climate change. COP26 is underlying the urgency of producing the kinds of evidence that can drive policy and action, positioning peatlands as a superpowered, nature-based solution to the climate crisis. The kind of change embedded in the principles that Jesse has just spoken about is the kind of change that I personally want to see, because despite the all-pervasiveness of the impact agenda nowadays, it's done very little to change how most of us actually do our research or how we engage with stakeholders. In fact, there's evidence that in addition to the great good that has been done by funders and governments who've incentivized their researchers to generate impact, there's now a growing range of negative, unintended consequences. I work, as Diana said, as research lead for the IUCN UK Peatland programme, but I've heard similar complaints from people across the peatland policy and NGO community. There's a feeling that researchers just want to use us to get impact. And whether real or perceived, there's a growing sense that the impact agenda has created conflicts of interest for researchers whose funding and promotion prospects are now linked to whether people like us use their research or not. The reason we're in this situation is because universities and research institutes have tried to facilitate change from the top down via extrinsic incentives. And as a result, the impact culture in many institutions is more about being able to evidence and communicate tangible, instrumental impacts that you can kind of touch and feel and easily measure and communicate and shout about than it is about actually serving the public good or helping people in need. So I want to pause and ask you to ask yourself a question. What is my impact culture? You might think about your institution, maybe go closer to home, your research group, whoever you work most closely with. But at whatever scale comes to mind, I want you to think about how healthy you feel your impact culture is. Now, if I'm going to answer this question, then we're all going to need a bit of a definition. And my colleague, Professor Johan Feisy, and I recently published this definition. Impact culture is about communities of people with complementary purpose who use their research to benefit society. And so a healthy impact culture emerges from clear individual and shared purpose. It generates impacts that are based on rigorous, ethical, and action-oriented research. It forms and is lived out by groups of people as they interact with both academic and non-academic communities. And it builds internal capacity and leadership that facilitate the research, community, and purpose that underpin impact. But this is, for me, more than just a definition or a framework. It is a call for action to start changing how we work today with the Peatland researchers in this session and with our closest colleagues. You don't have to wait for new leadership or move jobs to create the kind of culture that nurtures and inspires you. In my article with Professor Feisy and my forthcoming Impact Culture book, I've laid out a blueprint for grassroots change in our research institutions, a change we can all lead ourselves, that starts with understanding our purpose more clearly than ever before, and ends in more authentic relationships with those who are looking to us for answers. So, as Jesse described, we can genuinely co-produce research that addresses global challenges. And this is where I want to spend the rest of my time with you and do a bit of a deep dive into the community component of the impact culture framework. That's where we're going to focus our discussion groups, which are coming up next. But first, I want to ask you some diagnostic questions about your stakeholder community. I think most of us are pretty good at investing in our academic community, but we rarely make time to, say, go for coffee with our stakeholders, prioritize stakeholder conferences and events, or make an effort to stay in touch with our non-academic partners in the same way we do with our academic collaborators. So, how do you and your colleagues measure up to these questions? First of all, how much time do you spend outside project meetings and between projects with non-academic partners? Do you return emails, calls, and messages on social media from those beyond the academy who engage with your work? Do you make unrealistic promises to non-academic project partners? And how do you deal with non-delivery? Do you tell people you meet at workshops and events like this that you'll be in touch, and then inadvertently kind of bin their business card a few weeks later? Now, my goal is not to try and make you all feel guilty, but I do want you to think about the cumulative impact of seemingly small decisions not to prioritize our relationships with our non-academic partners. What we need more of is social capital. And there's both a depth and a breadth component to this. Partly, this is about systematically mapping your stakeholder community using some sort of stakeholder analysis and identifying the gaps so you can broaden your networks systematically and strategically. But you also need to think about building trust across these networks. Building deep relationships at scale, of course, isn't practical, so I usually prioritize a small number of key relationships, for example, investing in my role as research lead for IUCN and helping with the Global Peatlands Initiative. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to discuss actions that could enable you to build the kind of social capital you need to do the sorts of transdisciplinary and transformative research that Jesse was talking about earlier. You might want to discuss an action that you started thinking about just now when I put those questions on the screen. Or you might want to think about something bigger. I'm going to conclude now with a few ideas that you might want to think more about in your groups. And my first set of ideas is around creating a compassion culture in your team. Now, compassion, very simply, is empathy with action. So it enables us to both connect with the needs of those around us and take appropriate steps to help them. But of course, the hardest part is learning self-compassion. I know I'm certainly on that journey still. Most of us need help with that. So why not consider hiring a trainer to help your team build compassion skills? They exist. And so then you might follow this up with an acts of kindness challenge, where you will do an act of kindness each day for 1 week to see what ripple effect this has on the people around you. Or you could run a seminar series on learning from failure to normalize and give people permission to talk about failure and build self-compassion and resilience as a group. My second and final set of ideas is around experimenting with more creative stakeholder engagement initiatives. And I'm talking here about trying to go beyond the traditional webinars nowadays and stakeholder advisory panels and thinking about, say, integrating citizen science into your research or your teaching, creating pop-up science shops to engage the public with your research and find out more about what concerns them. You might want to organize a knowledge exchange seminar with equal numbers of sessions led by researchers and stakeholders focusing on issues relevant to policy and practice. You could arrange mutual secondments where you work for a few weeks in a stakeholder organization and then they work in your institution. These are just a few ideas I picked up over the years, but now it's time to hear from you. And this is my question for all of you for our discussion. How could you personally build stronger relationships with non-academic partners so you can co-produce transdisciplinary peatland research that has more impact? I want you to keep the discussion as practical as possible. So please don't be afraid to share seemingly small ideas like prioritizing a workshop with policymakers that you weren't sure about attending until today. Maybe that inspires someone else to join in or to reevaluate their schedule. So keep it personal, write the actions onto your to-do list, and you might want to discuss some of the ideas that I've just described. But again, try and keep them personal. Don't just discuss them in the abstract. How might I apply this? What would be the barriers in my own context that might prevent me from doing this? Now, this is going to work in two different ways. So if you are in person in the pavilion, then Julie is going to give you a wee wave just now. Julie will be facilitating your discussion. She'll take notes and she'll then report back to us. If you're discussing this online, I want you to all take personal responsibility for reporting back, and you're going to be doing that using the Q&A function and then upvoting the things that you like best. And the way this is going to work, I'll just share my screen so that you can see, is if you just scroll down on the web page where you're watching us now, you can say I've paused Diana at the top there, right to the bottom underneath the translation, you can see a whole series of breakout rooms. Don't click on this yet and join it yet, please. I'm just explaining how this works. Click on that breakout room and you'll see here, join a meeting, join that meeting, and a new tab will open up and then join the call. Now, as you noticed, there are 10 different breakout rooms, and so I'm going to ask you to choose your favorite number, and with luck, that will randomly allocate people so that this works. If you have less than 3 people, if it's just you and one other person, you've been there for a couple of minutes, then I'd like you to leave that room and go and find another room. There's no upper limit to the rooms, but you do need at least 3 people for a good discussion, I would suggest. So we'll let you know when the time is up. So Diana will give everyone in the room a 2-minute warning, and I'll come around in the last few minutes just giving you a warning. And we're going to do this for 15 minutes. So we will come back at 15:15. So I think we can just now open the rooms. So Diana, unless there's anything you want to add, we're going to come back here at 15 minutes past. So that's just less than 15 minutes. So that gives us then a 15-minute plenary discussion as well. So 15:15, manage your time, please, if you're online, and enjoy discussion if you're there in person. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the main room. I hope you made your way back. Otherwise, you might be, frantically helping other people in the chat by sending the links. I wanted just to invite all of the participants in the virtual world to type the best practical ideas that you heard into the Q&A tab. So you'll see that there's a Q&A function, and then you'll see the opportunity to upvote your favorites. Then I'm going to invite Julie, who's on the ground in the physical pavilion, to report back on the discussions with the physical participants via the microphone, so that the virtual participants can also hear the summary. Mark will then type those ideas into the Q&A while Julie is speaking. He's a speed typer. And us virtual participants will vote them up.
Yep. So hi everyone. I'm joining from the physical pavilion here at the UNEP COP26 at the Peatlands Pavilion. So the discussions of our breakout group were very productive and interactive. And I'm gonna try to summarize in 1 or 2 key points. So Miriam here today told us that to connect with different stakeholders, we need to understand their background, which might be different realities, and design products from the data that we collect that are understandable and usable by these people, and that we need for that we need to use appropriate language, and that is also more understandable by these people, so that we can demystify data and make it reliable to the people. The second point that we discussed is to make the bridge between science and people, we need to build trust. And for that, you need to involve the community from stage 1. And that means explaining them the process of your research, and using community champions usually is a good way for that, so that they can connect the people and the policymakers or the researchers and build trust and confidence in the community. Thank you.
Great. So I have input that to the Q&A. If you are on the virtual platform, then please make sure you put your perspectives in, and this is each person individually telling us what are the actions that are emerging from this discussion. And I'd like everyone then to use whether it's on your phone in the actual pavilion or online to upvote your favorites. Shall I read through a few of these? Diana, are you looking at the ones which have been upvoted as well?
Yeah, I have them actually.
Great.
They're starting to be voted up, but I think we should leave them a little bit longer to see more votes.
Yeah, it takes a minute to actually read them as well before you can upvote them. So let's take a pause. Good idea.
We can just wait, it's fine. Okay, I think we've got some. We ready to come back now? Okay. Great, thanks so much, everyone. I think we now have some votes, some thumbs up. I'm just reading on another screen, so I'm not trying to ignore you. I'm just going to read through it. The top two tied votes. Let's go for the first one, which is build a database for peat researchers on good methods of stakeholder engagement with resources of experts to contact. Also make connections to specialists in designing and facilitating stakeholder engagement at EU universities to help us use then the second one is to make a bridge between science and people. We need to build trust and to do what we need to involve the community from stage one, which means using community champions to connect researchers and policymakers and build trust and confidence in the community. Relationship building is the next one. Relationship building before and outside of having a specific project in mind.
Great. So can I comment on the first of these?
Please go for it.
And the chat is also live, so if you have your own views, please stick ideas into the chat as well. But this first one that you read out, I think that it is important to consider when you need to employ a professional facilitator. I think where you've got high stakes situations, high conflict situations, or where you're not independent as a researcher, then it can be really valuable to employ a professional facilitator, but they are quite expensive, so you need to plan ahead for that, ideally. Or you can get some facilitation skills yourself to make that a bit easier for you. Ultimately, though, there is one thing that the facilitator has to do, more importantly than anything else, and that is managing the power dynamics. Yeah, whatever technique you've mentioned here, charrettes, we can use post-it notes. In the Kalahari, in my PhD, we're using stones as counters and drawing things into the sand. There's a whole load of techniques out there. I've put a link into the chat to some of the free methods that I've pulled together. And great, let's avail ourselves of those techniques, learn a few things ourselves. But every now and then, you just have to bring in the professionals. Jesse, I'm aware in particular, there was a question someone said about how to do this in developing countries, and the Adaptation Research Alliance is a Southern-led initiative, and I wonder, how do you deal with some of the power dynamics of working with transdisciplinary teams from both the North and the South?
Yes, great question, Mark, and I saw that come in as well. And I think really it's let's say not a mystery, because you've really touched on it. It has to do with being conscious and recognizing the power dynamics that are at play, and then of course using or taking into account the need for this trust building and for starting these relationships from the very start. Those came up in some of these comments that are put into the chat here and have been upvoted. So it's great to see that. And as you mentioned, this transdisciplinary approach of the ARA is really, again, is bridging science and action, or as one of the comments here, science and people. And they highlight it as building trust, making sure that really when you are engaging those on the front line, those who will be your end users of the research. And that could be in a policy context, or it could be at a community level on the ground. Really, that end user varies greatly depending on the type of research and type of project you're working on. But no matter who the end user is to engage them from the start and engage them recognizing that if you are the one who has the upper hand in the power dynamics, you just have to pay extra careful attention to that. And when you're going into conversations, keep in mind that dynamics exist, and they're very easy for maybe you with the upper hand to forget. And that just would then, again, further entrench these, the existing power dynamics, which is something that we just have to actively avoid.
Yeah.
Great. Are there some more that you want to comment on, Mark?
Well, maybe just building on Jesse's point, should people like you and I, white Western males, actually be doing what we're doing? Should you be leading the ARA? Should I be writing about these issues around empowerment and such like? I was explaining to you earlier that I was recently criticized for a paper that I'm writing, that it was actually fundamentally racist, and it forced me to really stop and take stock of myself, because what I was being accused of doing, quite rightly, was white centering. So great, I'm talking about empowering marginalized groups, but actually, do I have the right to say this? And the person I was discussing this was saying, yeah, actually, Mark, you don't have that right. You should not be writing this. You should stop trying to write stuff like this and actually spend that time instead empowering those voices. And that's quite challenging. Does that mean that, what do we do in that situation?
Yes, good question, and a very slippery slope, I guess, in some cases. But I would say I don't think it is necessarily a bad thing. I think that really is still part of this process. It is, again, recognizing these power imbalances, recognizing that these types of paradigm shifts, from whether it be research to a kind of a greater research implementation linkage, or whether it be rebalancing the power dynamics of North-South, whether that be in academia or in development context. I think it's a process, and I think it is fine to have, again, as you had said, maybe white males like ourselves leading some of these initiatives. But at the same time, we just have to be aware of that. As I said, we have to be aware of this power dynamic. And this is something that I very much see in the future of the ARA. It would be very much Southern-led, with a Southern-led head of secretariat. We very much aim to have the members themselves, and particularly members from the South, really determine and contribute to the activities and the work streams of the ARA. And again, we will be making conscious efforts to ensure that this is something that we as a secretariat are able to enable within our ARA membership.
Yeah, that's great. So much to learn, and I'd love to have the opportunity to continue learning with you. Diana, I think if you want to kind of close things up, I think one of the things I'm excited to come out of this session is the opportunity to continue collaborating between ARA and the Global Peatland Initiative's Research Working Group, which Diana and I chair. So hopefully this is the beginning of a conversation.
Yes, absolutely. And I just want to make one last comment. I think that, you know, as individuals that have the responsibility and the opportunity and the privilege of, you know, leading global initiatives or even groups, you have to step back, you know, recognize and step back and create space for people. Teams are dynamic. We need more diversity. Diversity only brings about better solutions, more creativity and empowerment. And really, everyone wants their work to be relevant and impactful, and it has to be context specific. So you have to know what you're doing, where you're doing it, and who it needs to be done by. Thanks so much, everyone. I think it's kind of bizarre living in this virtual world, but it's really our honor to be here from the safety of our own homes or workplaces. And thank you so much, everyone that is actually on the ground there in the Peatland Pavilion. Thank you, Julie. I know you push yourself, and I'm really proud of you. Thank you so much, Patrick, and everyone else behind the scene that pushed us into a little bit of a really new opportunity. Breakout rooms on the cloud. Not as straightforward as we hoped, but I think it was effective. I hope you enjoyed getting to know new people, and we'd love to see the chat. How did you feel about that? Was it awkward? Was it great? Did it feel more inclusive? Do you feel like your voices were heard? That's what we want to hear, everyone's voice, wherever you may be around the country, whatever your perspective. We're looking forward to it. So thanks so much, everyone. Let's be in touch, connect, and don't be shy. Reach out, reach in, and reach across. Good night.